Mrs. Speaker, I am Sandra Shorty. Once again, I'm happy to be with you. I think the film we're about to see is called 9/11 Truth. It features interviews with architects, engineers, scientists, scholars, other professionals, and people who were at the scene.
I'm Tony Zambodi. I'm a mechanical engineer from the Philadelphia area with over 20 years of experience in the aerospace industry, where I design structures for aircraft and spacecraft and support equipment. Neither NIST or FEMA followed standard protocol for fire and explosion investigations, or just fire investigations for that matter. National Fire Protection Association Guide number 921 calls for saving the evidence and being prepared to justify why you wouldn't. It also calls for testing for accelerants and explosives when high-order damage is involved. NIST did not do this. NIST is often responsible for generating information which the NFPA guides are written from. It makes one wonder why the NFPA standard would not be followed in this case. NIST has not answered this question publicly.
There's national standards that need to be followed. And when I started looking into that, I went into the investigation manual. And so it's called the NFPA 921, and it's the fire and explosion. It's the guide for fire and explosions investigations. And so what it is, it's a national standard. So if an investigator from New York has to come out to the West Coast to help with something, they can fit right in seamlessly into the system and know what their role is and what they need to be doing. And so I went and I got the manual from 2001, and I went back and I looked at the footage from the original days of 9/11. There were all kinds of firefighters and civilians that were reporting explosions.
Okay, all right. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Just the fact that there were explosions means they need to be investigated. Terrorists used explosives in '93. We had witnesses to explosions. We have audio recording of explosions. We have overwhelming evidence that there were some explosive events. The manual gets into thermite, and if it says if you have melted steel or concrete, which we had on 9/11, and there's videos of it, people can see it, we should test for it. It says when you have melted steel or concrete, you test for thermite. So the fact that they're not testing for it is crazy. We had 3,000 Americans murdered, and we had the first 3 high-rise and steel collapses. We have all these reports of explosions. We have the vans pulled over. We have the history of terrorists using explosives. It's absolutely ridiculous that there's no excuse for it. It's criminal, in my opinion. It's absolutely criminal that they refuse to follow the national standards, and the national standards say that they should be testing that for explosives. One of the other big issues we have, the firefighters that are members of the Firefighters for 9/11 Truth, is just the blatant destruction of evidence. We're not talking about a little bit of evidence. They destroyed all the steel, basically the bones of the building that would have told us how this first high-rise steel structure in history that hadn't been struck by an airplane, all it had was a few fires on several floors, and it had only been burning for a few hours. We've had other high-rises burn much longer. This was the way we could have learned from this, was analyzing that, looking at the steel and seeing how this collapsed and how it failed and which steel members did what. Well, we can't do that, because what they did immediately after 9/11 was they started removing the steel, the debris from Tower 7 and all the towers immediately. Why were they destroying this? They sent it off to China to be recycled. So they never had any physical evidence to do the investigation. The national standards are very clear. We have preservation of evidence, we have spoliation of evidence, there's all kinds of basically standards that you don't destroy evidence. So that's what we're calling for. We're calling for an investigation into the investigators, why they destroyed this. We're calling for a reinvestigation that follows national standards. And the big thing is everybody says this is in the past, leave it in the past, and that's not true. We have ground zero workers dying today. They're getting cancers, and several of them don't have medical insurance. The FDNY, most of them are being taken care of by the department, but there were so many thousands of volunteers and members of other departments that showed up, and they were there for months afterwards, and they don't have the medical coverage. They can't make their house payments. They're sick and dying, and we as a country are ignoring them. We promised we'd never forget, but it looks to me like most people have forgotten, and they want us to forget, and that's what we're here for, is to basically just ask people to take another look into this, show some compassion, and let's help our brothers and sisters out and really reinvestigate 9/11. It's changed our world. It's, not to mention that there were 343 brothers murdered, but we're at war over this. We've lost a lot of our freedoms over this, and we don't have the real story on what happened because there wasn't a proper investigation done.
As reported by the New York Times, engineers were baffled by the collapse of Building 7. Since no steel frame high-rise has ever completely collapsed due to fire, how are we to understand this mysterious event?
My name is Scott Granger. I'm a licensed fire protection engineer. I'm licensed in 13 states. I've been in private practice for 25 years. I've been a practicing engineer for 39 years. 50% of my practice is in forensic engineering. Steel structural frame buildings, high-rise buildings, simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
In my previous career as a firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
I am Dan Barnum, FAIA, a graduate architect from Rice University with a Bachelor of Architecture degree. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I've designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings. Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1 shell and 2 shell here in Houston, and I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. I've designed high-rise buildings, and I know what they do in fires because I've studied that. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
My name is Jonathan Smolens, PE. I'm a professional structural engineer in the Boulder, Denver area for the past 12 years. And one of my specialties is forensic engineering, including evaluation of structures post-disaster. What happened to those columns to all collapse at the same time? The explanation provided does not match the evidence that we have.
My name is Michael Donnelly, PE. I'm a structural engineer with 14 years of experience. I get involved mostly with the design of steel-framed fireproof buildings. We've never had a steel-framed skyscraper collapse in the United States or internationally. So there's no precedent. I don't think Building 7 could have collapsed by fire, as NIST tells us that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building, in a matter of seconds, there's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
I'm Ed Woniak, licensed fire protection engineer for at least 25 years, and I work for a number of organizations, city, federal, large insurance companies, consultant, always in the area of fire safety, and with the goal of keeping the public safe and first responders safe. I became fascinated with the government's version of the events on 9/11, because this was totally contrary to everything that I've ever experienced, either working in the field of fire safety or knowing what I know about mechanical engineering. It defies many fundamentals of mechanics and materials and physics and just many fundamental engineering concepts.
World Trade Center 7, NIST claims the fires were very large, very hot, and long-lasting, when in reality, observation, which has been researched by many people, shows these fires did not last very long. They were not in the locations where NIST claims they were at given times.
According to lead investigator Shyam Sunder of the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, World Trade Center 7 collapsed at free-fall acceleration for more than 100 feet of its fall. What does the speed of the collapse reveal to us?
Essentially, in less than 7 seconds, Tower 7 came down upon itself.
Building 7, NIST reports admits fell at the rate of gravity for the first 100 feet. Well, that's impossible unless there's nothing resisting it.
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet. And the only way you can get that is when there's zero resistance. And so what we're looking at is a building just coming straight down, falling right through itself with zero resistance. Buildings don't have zero resistance, which is why you feel comfortable walking into a building.
A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it without it being blown up. That's the only way it could come down at free fall.
The failure of all these connections as the primary means of structural failure is inconsistent with a natural gravitational collapse, and indicates the presence of other agents which would dismember these connections.
I'm David Chandler. I have a bachelor's degree in physics from Harvey Mudd College and a master's in education from Claremont Graduate University and another master's in mathematics from California Polytechnic University. I've been teaching for over 30 years. Heard people say, well, it came down at free fall or close to free fall and so forth, so I decided I'd measure it myself. I had a simple tool at the time called Physics Toolkit, which allowed me to take a video and put a dot on each frame to follow the motion of things. And so you can measure speeds and accelerations and it'll do the analysis. The fundamental laws of nature is the conservation of energy. In order for it to be falling down with zero resistance, it means that resistance had to have been removed by something else.
Now, NIST claims that the columns were buckling in the first several seconds before the free fall occurred. Now, I don't see how that's possible.
And in the final report, they modified it, they tried to doctor it up. They still tried to say that it was essentially correct, but then they modified it and they actually admitted there was a period of free fall involved. But they never changed their model. Like, how do you all of a sudden allow for free fall when they just got done explaining how it couldn't have been in free fall? If I were a scientist, I'd be embarrassed to try to put forward something like that. It was clearly a fraudulent argument.
In other words, NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them.
Free falling for 8 stories. So we know that happened. Okay, it's been measured and it's on videos. Everyone can see it. NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories. That's a bothersome part of the puzzle because NIST never explained it.
Absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So that evidence alone would indicate that the official story doesn't hold water.
There was no time for this elastic deformation and plastic deformation, which would have absorbed energy and decreased the descent to less than free fall speed. As energy is drained away from the system to deform those members, it would slow down the descending mass and cause a descent at less than free fall speed.
40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere. A building cannot do free fall with a huge steel structural system in place to support it.
There's no resistance until the building is down maybe halfway.
Buildings tend to be delayed as they collapse. They don't just pancake down like this in a very short period of time.
If the pancake theory works, it's going to hit hesitation, and there was no hesitation.
Going from motionless to free fall instantly.
One continuous motion. There couldn't have been any structural resistance.
Buildings just don't behave like that. If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it, and there's some delay there.
This is inconsistent with the energy redistribution that would be required from the descending mass to the remaining structure.
Completely impossible. And NIST themselves have to recognize the implications of this. The fact that they haven't is fraudulent.
The connections are designed with a safety factor of 1.5 to 3 times the failure load for the member. So this assures that the member will always fail first in an elastic mode and then a plastic mode.
Ideally, the member would fail before the connection. You don't want the connections to fail first.
The connections failed first without any of the members exhibiting large deformations or deflections. Over 400 connections per second had to fail in order for the members to be released and for the structure to descend at almost free fall rate.
To fail at the rate that they did progressively across the building, even if a floor were to collapse, it still wouldn't be able to collapse all of the connections simultaneously at the rate that it did without secondary explosions.
There's no hesitation. There was no hesitation when it was to hit story after story.
If you were to look at a standard moment frame steel connection, which is a welded connection between the beam and the column, it would take on the order of around 500,000 pounds to shear off one connection. And if you multiply that by 400, put maybe a safety factor of 4, you would require 50 million pounds of force per second in order to collapse the building the way it was shown based on the NIST report and what we saw on the video evidence of the video of the building that day. It's highly unlikely, don't know how that could ever happen without secondary explosions. It's not logical or reasonable.
The fact that it's coming down at free fall says all of the energy is being used to just make it go straight down, which means it's coming down through itself and not breaking up the building as it goes. Something else has to be clearing the way. And that is smoking gun evidence to me. I think that's one of the primary pieces of evidence that these buildings really were demolished. They weren't just accidents that happened.
We might anticipate that an unevenly damaged building would fall over. Yet, videos of the collapse of Building 7 show a fairly symmetrical fall. How do we make sense of this?
The exterior of the building comes down fully, symmetrically, and at one time. Both sides of the building come down completely. This is fully indicative of full structural support being removed for at least 6 stories. That could not happen by fire.
If there was some fire in one corner, it would have collapsed maybe in that corner, but not the total building free falling.
If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse. We may have seen, the buildings actually topple over to one side, certainly not coming down in its own footprint.
And clearly a more asymmetrical pattern should have been present.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
It would not have been a uniform collapse. The building might have partially fallen over, but the building would not have collapsed as it did. This doesn't make any logical sense.
For it to come down straight down upon itself, you would need to basically take out the supports at the center, at the core.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
In my professional opinion, in my experience, for World Trade Center 7 to collapse straight down upon itself, as video indicates, as everything that we've witnessed, the supports at the center essentially all had to be taken out at once.
Well, that's another indicator that this report is very suspect, because I would have expected in a classic implosion, as I've seen numerous times, is the core to fail. My name's Tom Sullivan. I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdom, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Keith's Band gas holders in New York. I would expect the center of the building to start moving first, and then as the implosion progresses, then the sides come in, then the rest of the building is involved.
The country owns this. We were all victims. You all should want answers. It's not just ours, not just mine. We all lost something that day.